The mud-caked wagon rattled to a stop outside the general store in Redstone, Texas, and the sound it made was like old bones grinding together. The wheels had been complaining for 3 days straight ever since they left the county poorhouse back in Houston, and now as the wagon finally came to rest in a cloud of yellow dust, even the horse seemed relieved, dropping its head and blowing out a long, weary breath. Laura sat in the back of the wagon with her hands folded in her lap. She had chosen the name for herself during the long, sleepless nights at the poorhouse when she would lie awake and imagine a different life. Alora Whitfield. It sounded like someone who had a future, someone who might matter. But the name had not yet settled into her bones, and so she sat very still and tried to remember that she was Alara now that the past was behind her, and that whatever waited in this dusty little town at the edge of the Texas prairie could not possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. She was 18 years old. She had hazel eyes that turned gold and certain light, dark blonde hair that she kept pinned back from her face and hands that were red and rough from 4 years of scrubbing floors and wringing out laundry and doing whatever work the poorhouse demanded of its residents. She wore a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches, and around her thin shoulders she clutched a shawl so threadbare you could see daylight through it if you held it up to the sun. The wagon driver was a grizzled man named Pete, who had spoken perhaps 10 words to her during the entire 3-day journey. He sat up front, chewing tobacco and spitting into the dust, and when they finally stopped, he did not turn around to look at her. He just gestured with his chin toward the largest building on the street and said flat and indifferent as a man discussing the weather that Miss Marsh was expecting her. "She runs the mercantile," he said. "Said she would give you work and a place to sleep." Alara nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. She gathered the small bundle that contained everything she owned in this world, 2 dresses that were more patches than cloth, a spare pair of stockings with holes in both heels, a hairbrush with half its bristles missing, and a small leather Bible that had belonged to her mother, and she climbed down from the wagon. Her worn boots hit the packed earth of Redstone's main street, and the impact traveled up through her legs and into her chest like a heartbeat. She was here. She was really here. The town was small. Perhaps 24 buildings clustered along a single thoroughfare with the vast Texas prairie stretching endlessly in every direction like a golden sea frozen in mid-wave. The summer heat of 1872 pressed down on everything with the weight of a wool blanket, thick and relentless and inescapable. The air shimmered above the dusty road, and somewhere a dog barked once and then fell silent, as though even the animals found the heat too oppressive for sustained effort. But the heat was not what made Alara's stomach clench. It was the eyes. 20 pairs of them at least fixed upon her from porches and doorways and windows, from behind the counter of the feed store and from the bench outside the barber shop. 20 pairs of eyes watching the girl who had just climbed down from the poorhouse wagon, cataloging every detail of her appearance, her patched dress, her threadbare shawl, the pitiful smallness of her bundle, the way she stood in the street looking lost and alone, and drawing their conclusions. She could feel the weight of their judgment settling onto her shoulders like a physical thing, heavier than the heat, heavier than the exhaustion of 3 days on a jolting wagon, heavier than the grief she still carried for parents 4 years dead. A woman in a blue calico dress stood on the porch of the building next to the mercantile, leaning toward her companion and speaking in a voice that was not quite a whisper and not quite an announcement, but something precisely in between designed to be overheard. She came from the poorhouse. The words floated across the dusty air like seeds from a dandelion light, and drifting and impossible to catch, and they landed everywhere in every doorway and on every porch, taking root in the minds of Redstone's good citizens. "Poor thing probably does not have a penny to her name," another voice added, this one from somewhere behind Alara, somewhere she could not see. Alara kept her chin up. She fixed her hazel eyes straight ahead on the mercantile door, on the future, on the only thing that mattered, which was putting one foot in front of the other and refusing to let them see her break. She had learned this skill in the poorhouse, this art of walking through hostility without flinching, of absorbing cruelty, without letting it reach the soft and vulnerable places inside her, where she kept what was left of her hope. Her parents had died when she was 14. The yellow fever had come through Houston like a scythe through standing wheat, cutting down the strong and the weak alike with terrible indifference. Her father, a carpenter named James Whitfield, had been the first to fall. He was a quiet, steady man who had taught Ilara to read using the Bible and old newspapers, who had built their small house with his own hands, and who had told her every night before bed that she was smart and brave, and that the world would be lucky to have her in it. He died on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday her mother was gone too. Her mother, whose name had been Rose, who had loved music and singing, who had hummed melodies while she cooked, and who had a laugh that sounded like bells in a warm wind. Rose Whitfield, who had held her daughter's hand on that last night and whispered that she must be brave, that she must not give up, that God had a plan for her, even if they could not see it yet. With no family and no means, and no one willing to take in an orphan girl, Ilara had been sent to the county poorhouse. She spent 4 years there, 4 years of scrubbing floors until her knees bled, 4 years of mending other people's clothes until her fingers were permanently pricked and scarred, 4 years of eating watered-down soup and sleeping in a crowded dormitory where the air smelled of lye soap and despair and the slow erosion of human dignity. She had survived it, though there were nights when surviving felt more like a punishment than a mercy. The poorhouse was a long, low building with peeling whitewash and windows that let in the cold in winter and the mosquitoes in summer, and it smelled always of boiled cabbage and lye soap and the particular sour sadness of people who have given up expecting anything from life. There were 37 residents when Ilara arrived, ranging from elderly men who sat in the corners staring at nothing to children younger than she was, who had already learned to make themselves invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to eat quickly and quietly and never ever ask for more. The matron was a woman named Mrs. Flagg, a thick-bodied, heavy-jawed woman who ran the poorhouse the way a general runs a campaign, with rigid schedules and strict discipline and a complete absence of warmth. She was not cruel exactly, but she was so thoroughly devoid of kindness that the distinction hardly mattered. Under Mrs. Flagg's watch, Ilara learned to scrub floors on her hands and knees until the wood turned pale. She learned to mend clothing so neatly that the patches were almost invisible. She learned to cook for 40 people with ingredients that would barely feed 10, stretching every cup of flour and every scrap of meat into something that could technically be called a meal. She also learned things that Mrs. Flagg did not intend to teach her. She learned to read people, to know, by the set of a jaw or the flicker of an eye, what someone was thinking before they said it. She learned to endure humiliation without letting it reach the core of who she was, to build a wall between her surface self, the obedient, grateful poorhouse girl, and her true self, the girl who read her mother's Bible by candlelight and whispered the words aloud to keep her voice from forgetting how to speak her own thoughts. She learned that dignity was not something that could be given or taken by others. It was something you carried inside you, invisible and untouchable, like a flame in a glass jar. And she learned to hope quietly, secretly, the way prisoners learn to hope, nurturing the belief that someday, somehow, the door would open and she would walk through it into a life that was hers to shape. That door opened when she was 18. A letter came from a Miss Gertrude Marsh in Redstone, Texas, responding to a notice the poorhouse had posted seeking positions for its older residents. Miss Marsh needed help in her mercantile. She would provide room board and modest wages. It was not much, but to Ilara, who had spent 4 years sleeping in a dormitory with 11 other women and eating food that tasted of nothing but survival, it sounded like the gates of paradise. She had survived the poorhouse by holding on to the memory of her father's voice, telling her she was brave, by pressing her mother's Bible against her chest at night and imagining she could still smell Rose's perfume on its pages, by making herself useful and quiet and indispensable, until the administrators grudgingly acknowledged that Ilara Whitfield was not like the other charges, that she was smart and capable, and that she deserved a chance. And now she had been given that chance. Work for Miss Marsh in Redstone, Texas. Room and board and $1 a week. It was not much. It was everything. The mercantile door swung open before she could reach it, and a woman stepped out who looked as though she had been carved from the same hard Texas earth that surrounded them. Miss Gertrude Marsh was in her 50s, with iron gray hair pulled back in a bun so severe it seemed to tighten the skin of her face, and eyes that moved over Ilara's appearance with a swift, comprehensive assessment of someone accustomed to appraising merchandise. "You are late." The words were flat, without inflection or emotion. "I expected you yesterday. The wagon had trouble with the wheel, ma'am. We had to stop for repairs." Miss Marsh's expression did not change. Not a flicker of sympathy, not a trace of warmth. Well, you are here now. Come inside. I will show you where you will sleep and what your duties will be. I expect hard work. I do not tolerate laziness, and I do not tolerate complaints. Yes, ma'am. Elara followed the older woman into the dim interior of the mercantile, breathing in the familiar mixed scent of flour and tobacco and leather and dried herbs. The space was cramped, every square inch packed with goods. Barrels of beans and rice lined one wall. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, loaded with canned goods and patent medicines and tools. Bolts of fabric were stacked against the far wall in neat, colorful towers. A glass case near the counter held small luxuries, ribbons and buttons and hair combs and penny candy. The floor was worn smooth by years of boots and shoes and the restless pacing of customers who could not decide between one thing and another. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light that came through the front windows, drifting slowly like tiny golden worlds. Behind the counter, a large iron cash register sat with the gravity of a church organ, its brass keys gleaming dully in the half-light. The walls were covered with advertisements and notices. A patent medicine poster promising miraculous cures for everything from rheumatism to broken hearts. A calendar from the previous year that no one had thought to replace a handwritten sign that read, "All accounts must be settled by the first of each month," in Miss Marsh's precise, unforgiving handwriting. It smelled, Alara thought, like possibility, like the raw materials of 100 different lives waiting to be assembled. A narrow staircase at the back led to the upper floor, and Miss Marsh was already climbing it, her footsteps sharp and precise on the wooden treads. You will sleep in the storage room upstairs. It is not much, but it is clean. You will be up before dawn to sweep the store and restock the shelves. During the day, you will help customers and keep the accounts. I will provide 2 meals a day and $1 per week in wages. On Sundays, you may attend church if you wish, but you will still need to prepare supper. The storage room was barely larger than a closet. There was a narrow cot pushed against one wall, a single window that let in a rectangle of harsh Texas light, and 3 hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. The ceiling was low enough that Alara could touch it without fully extending her arm, and the air was hot and still trapped beneath the roof where the sun had been beating down all day. Alara set her bundle on the cot and turned to face Miss Marsh. "Thank you for this opportunity, ma'am. I will work hard. You will not regret taking me on." Miss Marsh studied her for a long moment, those sharp eyes searching for something, weakness perhaps, or deception, or the kind of desperation that might make a girl unreliable. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed not to find it, because her expression shifted slightly, not into warmth exactly, but into something that might have been grudging acknowledgement. "We shall see. Now come down and I will show you the inventory system." The rest of that first day passed in a blur of information and physical labor. Alara learned the location of every item in the store, memorized the prices that Miss Marsh rattled off with the speed of an auctioneer, and began to understand the older woman's exacting standards, which were considerable. Everything had its place. Every penny had to be accounted for. Every customer had to be treated with respect, regardless of how they treated you. By the time evening fell and the store closed and the last customer had gone home to supper, Alara's feet ached so badly she could barely walk, and her head spun with exhaustion and the sheer volume of new information she had absorbed. But she had made it through. She had completed her first day in Redstone, Texas, and she had not broken, had not wept, had not given anyone the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She lay on the narrow cot that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town settling into sleep. The distant bark of a daw, the creak of the building's timbers cooling after the long hot day, the low murmur of voices from the saloon down the street, and occasional laughter, rough and male and tinged with whiskey. A horse clopping slowly down the main street, its rider humming something tuneless and sad. Somewhere far off, a coyote called out to the empty sky, a sound so lonely and wild it made Alara's chest ache with a kinship she could not have explained. The cot was thin, and the mattress smelled of old straw, but it was hers alone. In the poorhouse, she had slept in a row of 12 beds so close together that you could hear your neighbor breathing and feel them shift in their sleep, and privacy was a concept as foreign and unreachable as the moon. Here in this cramped little room above the mercantile, she had a door she could close and 4 walls that belonged only to her, and that small luxury felt like an almost unbearable gift. Despite her bone-deep exhaustion, sleep would not come. She could not stop thinking about the whispers, the stares, The way the woman in the blue calico dress had said those words, she came from the poorhouse, as though describing a disease, a contamination, something that decent people should keep their distance from. But Alara had faced worse. She had watched her parents die. She had survived 4 years in an institution designed to strip away everything that made a person human and replace it with obedience and gratitude and shame. She had made it this far, and she would make it further. She pressed her mother's Bible against her chest and closed her eyes and promised herself, as she had promised herself every night in the poorhouse, that her past would not define her future. The days that followed fell into a grueling rhythm that Alara accepted with the grim determination of someone who understood that hard work was not punishment, but opportunity. She rose before dawn when the sky was still the color of a bruise, and she swept the store from front to back, raising clouds of dust that sparkled in the first pale light filtering through the windows. She restocked shelves and arranged displays and hauled sacks of flour and sugar that weighed nearly as much as she did. She learned the rhythms of the town through the rhythms of the store. Monday mornings brought the ranchers' wives, who came in groups of 2 or 3 and spent long minutes debating the merits of different calico prints, while their husbands waited outside in the shade, rolling cigarettes and discussing cattle prices. Tuesday was the day the freight wagon came from Houston, bringing new stock that had to be unpacked and inventoried and shelved before the store opened. Wednesday was quiet, a midweek lull when Miss Marsh took advantage of the slow hours to drill Alara on pricing and bookkeeping and the 100 small skills that made the difference between a mercantile that survived and one that failed. Thursday and Friday picked up again as people prepared for the weekend, and Saturday was chaos, the busiest day of the week, when it seemed like every person within 20 miles descended on Redstone to conduct their business and collect their gossip. Sunday was church and rest, though rest was a relative term. Alara still had to prepare supper and lay out the store for Monday morning. Through it all, she worked with a focus and intensity that left no room for self-pity. Her hands, already roughened by 4 years in the poorhouse, grew rougher still, the skin cracking at the knuckles from constant contact with flour dust and soap and the rough wooden handles of brooms and mops. Her shoulders ached from lifting. Her feet throbbed from standing on hard floors for 12 hours at a stretch. But she did not complain, not because Miss Marsh had forbidden it, but because every ache and pain was evidence that she was earning her place in the world, that she was building something, that she was more than what the poorhouse had made her. During the day, she helped customers with a quiet competence that surprised even Miss Marsh. Alara discovered that she had a natural gift for numbers, could add columns of figures in her head faster than most people could do it on paper. And she had a way with the customers that was neither obsequious nor familiar, but something in between, a warmth that made people feel attended to without feeling patronized. Miss Marsh noticed. She did not comment because commenting favorably was not in her nature, but she began to nod occasionally when Alara completed a task, and she stopped hovering over the girl's work with quite the same vigilance which was from Gertrude Marsh, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Still, the whispers followed Alara everywhere, clinging to her like the dust that clung to everything in Redstone. When she walked to the well to fetch water, in the morning where women would fall silent as she approached, their conversations dying mid-sentence, their eyes following her with that particular mixture of curiosity and contempt that small towns reserve for those they consider beneath them. When she attended church on Sunday, sitting alone in the back pew because no one invited her to sit with them, families shifted in their seats to maintain a careful distance, as though poverty might be contagious, as though the misfortune that had brought her to the poorhouse might somehow leap from her patched dress onto their clean Sunday clothes. She was the poorhouse girl, marked by circumstance and judged by people who had never known a day of true hardship in their comfortable, insulated lives. 3 weeks after her arrival, everything changed. It was a mid-morning in July, the heat already building toward its daily crescendo, and Alara was arranging a display of ribbons near the front window where the light was good and the colors showed to advantage. The door opened and she looked up, expecting a customer, expecting one of the farmers' wives, or perhaps old Mr. Loomis, who came in every Tuesday for chewing tobacco. Instead, a mountain walked through the doorway. That was her first impression, and she would never entirely shake it. The man who ducked through the entrance of the Redstone Mercantile had to turn sideways to fit his shoulders through the frame. He stood at least 6 feet and 4 inches tall, perhaps taller, and he was built with the kind of raw, functional strength that comes not from vanity or exercise, but from years of hard physical labor in an unforgiving landscape. His shoulders were massive, his arms thick with corded muscle, visible where his sleeves were rolled above the elbows, his chest broad beneath a simple homespun shirt that strained across it like canvas stretched over a barrel. His hair was dark brown, hanging past his collar, somewhat shaggy but clean. His face was weathered and deeply tanned, the face of a man who lived outdoors in all seasons, lined by wind and sun, and perhaps by harder things too, by memories and grief and the particular weariness that comes from prolonged solitude. A knife hung from his belt in a leather sheath, and he carried himself with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who knew his own capabilities and had no need to prove them to anyone. But it was his eyes that stopped Alara mid-motion, her hand still holding a length of blue ribbon. Her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs. They were gray-blue, the color of a winter sky reflected in still water, and they were sharp and intelligent and utterly at odds with his rough appearance. There was depth in those eyes, complexity, a whole interior world that his weathered exterior gave no hint of. He scanned the store quickly, the way a man scans open terrain, noting exits and obstacles and points of interest, and then his gaze found Alara and rested there for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary before moving on. Miss Marsh looked up from her ledger. "Mr. Blackwood, your usual order." "Yes, ma'am, and I will need extra salt this time. 20 pounds if you have it." His voice was deep and quiet, the kind of voice that carried without being raised, each word chosen carefully and delivered with the precise enunciation of a man who did not waste language. There was something almost musical about it, a low, resonant timbre that seemed to vibrate in the air after he finished speaking. "Alara, fetch Mr. Blackwood's order. The list is on the counter." Miss Marsh's command broke the spell, and Alara moved quickly, her hands finding the familiar rhythm of work. She gathered the items from their various locations throughout the store: flour, coffee beans, dried beans, sugar, ammunition for a rifle, a new whetstone, salt 20 pounds, which required 2 trips to the storeroom. She was acutely aware of the mountain man's presence the entire time, could feel his gaze following her movements, the way you can feel the sun on the back of your neck, warm and persistent and impossible to ignore. But when she glanced up, he was always politely looking elsewhere, at the display of hunting knives, at the almanac hanging from a nail on the wall, at his own hands, which were enormous, each finger as thick as a branch, but surprisingly clean and well kept for a man who lived in the wilderness. She carried the supplies to the counter and began tallying the cost, her fingers moving swiftly over the ledger. Math had always come easily to her. Numbers were honest. They did not judge or whisper or look at you sideways. They simply were what they were. "That will be $8.45, sir." He pulled a leather pouch from his pocket and counted out the coins with deliberate care, placing each one on the counter with a small, precise click. As he set down the last coin, his hand brushed hers. The contact was brief, accidental, entirely innocent. His skin was rough and warm, calloused from years of work, and the touch lasted no longer than the space between 2 heartbeats. But Alara felt something move through her at the contact, something electric and unfamiliar, a jolt of connection that had nothing to do with the physical sensation and everything to do with the sudden, startling recognition that this man was real in a way that most people were not, that he was fully and completely present in the world, solid and grounded and alive. "Thank you," he said, and he met her eyes directly for the first time. Up close, his face was striking. Not handsome in the way that Garrett Caldwell, the banker's son, was handsome, with his polished features and careful grooming. This was a different kind of beauty, entirely raw and unfinished and honest, like a mountain or a storm or an ancient tree. A straight nose, slightly crooked from having been broken at least once. A firm jaw shadowed with stubble. A mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile but might remember if given the right reason. And those eyes, those extraordinary gray-blue eyes that seemed to see past the surface of things and into the truth beneath. "You are welcome, sir." He gathered his supplies, loading them into a large canvas pack with practiced efficiency. But before he turned to leave, he paused, and Alara felt the air in the store shift as though something important was about to happen. "You are new in town." It was not a question. It was an observation delivered with the same quiet precision as everything else he said. but there was something underneath it, a gentleness, a recognition, as though he knew exactly what it was like to be new somewhere and to feel the weight of other people's stares. Yes, sir, I have been here about 3 weeks, he nodded slowly. Silas Blackwood. Most folks around here do not know me well enough to call me much of anything. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, amusement perhaps, or self-deprecation, and Alara realized that this man, this mountain of a man who could probably wrestle a bear and win, was shy. The realization made something warm bloom in her chest. Alara Whitfield. Miss Marsh was watching the exchange with narrowed eyes from behind her ledger, her pen suspended above the page, and Alara quickly busied herself with straightening the counter. Silas nodded once more and left his broad frame passing through the doorway, the door closing softly behind him, despite the size of the hand that pulled it shut. Do not get ideas about that one. Miss Marsh's voice cut through the air like a blade the moment he was gone. Silas Blackwood lives alone up in those hills 15 miles north of town. He traps and hunts and comes in for supplies once a month and barely speaks to anyone. He is not the sort of man who involves himself with town girls, and even if he were, you cannot afford the attention it would bring. I was not getting ideas, ma'am. I was simply being polite to a customer. Miss Marsh made a sound that conveyed precisely how much she believed that statement. See that you remember your place. But even as Alara went back to her work, arranging the ribbons that had been forgotten in the display, her hands moving automatically while her mind wandered elsewhere, she could not quite forget those gray-blue eyes. She could not forget the way Silas Blackwood had looked at her, not with the pity she was accustomed to, not with the judgment that followed her through Redstone like a shadow, not with the contempt that the townsfolk barely bothered to disguise. He had looked at her as though she were simply a person, as though where she came from mattered less than who she was, as though she were worth seeing. It was, she realized, the first time since her parents' death that anyone had looked at her that way. The following Sunday, Alara attended the morning service at Redstone's small white church. The building sat at the end of the main street, its whitewashed clapboards gleaming in the morning sun, its steeple reaching toward a sky so blue and vast it made you dizzy to look at it. Inside, the pews were worn smooth by decades of Sunday worship, and the air smelled of beeswax candles and old hymnals and the faint, comforting mustiness of a building that had stood through many seasons and many storms. Alara sat alone in the back pew as had become her habit. She had tried the first Sunday to sit in the middle of the church to take a place among the congregation, as though she belonged there. But the family in the pew ahead of her had shifted forward with a collective rustle of discomfort, and the woman beside her had moved so far toward the opposite end of the bench that she was practically sitting in the aisle. After that, Alara took the back pew without complaint. At least from there, she could watch the entire congregation, could study the faces, and learn the relationships and begin to understand the invisible architecture of power and allegiance that held this small community together. She opened her mother's Bible in her lap and tried to focus on Reverend Harlan's sermon about charity and the Christian duty of compassion toward those less fortunate. The irony was not lost on her. Reverend Harlan was a sincere man, earnest in his faith and generous in his delivery, but as he spoke about opening hearts to those in need, Alara could see the congregation nodding along with the comfortable agreement of people who believed charity was something you practiced at a safe distance, something you discussed in church, and then set aside the moment you stepped back into the sunlight. When the service ended, Alara stood to leave, intending to slip out quickly and walk back to the mercantile before anyone could corner her with their curiosity or their contempt. But she found her path blocked. Helena Caldwell stood in the center aisle, positioned with the deliberate precision of a woman accustomed to commanding rooms. She was the wife of Edgar Caldwell, who owned the Redstone Bank, and she was by unspoken but unanimous consensus the supreme authority on matters of social standing in the town. She was a handsome woman, in her late 40s, well-dressed and carefully groomed, with a face that might have been kind, if kindness had ever been required of it. Alara Whitfield. Her voice was pitched to carry not a shout but a projection, the practiced volume of someone who wanted to be heard by everyone present while maintaining the illusion of a private conversation. I understand you came to us from the Houston poorhouse. The remaining congregation members turned to watch. The rustle of fabric and the creak of wooden pews filled the church as bodies shifted to get a better view. Alara felt her spine straighten of its own accord. She felt the old, familiar shame trying to rise up from somewhere deep in her gut, trying to flood her chest and close her throat and make her eyes burn. She had felt it 1,000 times in the poorhouse every time an administrator reminded her of her place, every time a visitor walked through and looked at the residents as though they were livestock. She pushed it down. She had gotten very good at pushing it down. Yes, ma'am. My parents died when I was young. I had nowhere else to go. How unfortunate. Helena Caldwell's tone made it clear that she found it unfortunate, primarily because it meant Redstone now had to accommodate a poorhouse girl in its midst. You must understand that we have certain standards in this community. We are respectable people. I do hope you will not bring any of the poorhouse's less savory elements to our town. The words hung in the air of the church like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Alara could feel every eye upon her, could hear the silence stretching and tightening like a wire about to snap. Her hands clenched at her sides, her nails cutting into her palms. I am simply trying to work and live an honest life, ma'am. Nothing more. Helena Caldwell opened her mouth to respond, her expression already arranging itself into the next volley of condescension, when a voice cut through the tension like a blade through cloth. Mrs. Caldwell. Everyone turned. Every single person in that church turned toward the doorway where the voice had come from, and what they saw made several of them take an involuntary step backward. Silas Blackwood stood in the entrance of the Redstone Church, still dressed in his rough frontier clothes, buckskin trousers and a homespun shirt, and heavy boots that had never seen a cobbler's polish. His long dark hair was pushed back from his face, and he held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect for the house of worship that contrasted sharply with his wild appearance. He rarely attended services. His presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. Mr. Blackwood. Helena Caldwell's composure slipped for just a moment, surprise breaking through her careful facade before she recovered. I did not realize you were here today. I just arrived. He stepped fully into the church, and his presence seemed to fill the small space the way a thunderstorm fills a valley, not with noise but with pressure, with the sheer undeniable force of his being there. I could not help but overhear your conversation with Miss Whitfield. He paused, and in that pause the church was so quiet you could hear the dust settling in the beams of sunlight that slanted through the windows. It seems to me, he continued, his deep voice calm and measured, but carrying an authority that had nothing to do with money or social position, and everything to do with simple, unshakable conviction that working hard and living honest is exactly what any community should want from its people. Miss Whitfield here seems to be doing precisely that. Helena Caldwell's face flushed a deep, unbecoming red. Well, I was simply expressing, she began. I know what you were expressing, ma'am. Silas's voice remained polite, but beneath the politeness was something harder, something that would not bend. Judging a person by their circumstances rather than their character does not seem very Christian to me, especially not right after a sermon on charity and compassion. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Alara had ever heard. It roared in her ears. It pressed against her chest. It filled the church from floor to rafters, and in that silence, something shifted, something fundamental and irreversible, like the moment a river changes its course. Helena Caldwell opened and closed her mouth several times. She looked in that moment like a woman who had been struck and did not yet understand by what. She gathered her skirts, swept past Silas without another word, and pushed through the church door into the sunlight. Her husband Edgar, a thin, nervous man who had spent the entire exchange studying his shoes with intense fascination, hurried after her. The other congregation members dispersed quickly, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere, Sunday dinners to prepare livestock, to tend children to retrieve from the churchyard. Within moments, the church was empty, except for two people, Alara and Silas. You did not have to do that, Alara said quietly. Her heart was hammering in her chest and her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. Not from sadness, but from something far more complex, gratitude and relief, and the overwhelming shock of being defended by someone who had no obligation to do so. Yes, I did, Silas said. He settled his hat back onto his head, a gesture that seemed to ground him, to return him from the charged atmosphere of confrontation to his natural state of quiet self-containment. That woman had no right to speak to you that way. No one does. She is only saying what everyone else thinks. Then everyone else is wrong. He said it with such simple, absolute conviction that Alara felt something loosen in her chest. Some knot she had been carrying for 4 years, tied tight by shame and grief, and the accumulated weight of 10,000 small cruelties began to unravel. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that she could breathe a little deeper, stand a little taller. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas looked uncomfortable with the emotion shifting his weight from one boot to the other, his big hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. He was a man more at ease in the wilderness than in the company of other people, and emotional moments clearly fell outside his area of expertise. "Would you like me to walk you back to the mercantile? I need to speak with Miss Marsh about an order." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it, but Alara accepted it with a gratitude that went beyond words. They walked together down Redstone's dusty main street. The mountain man and the poorhouse girl, and Alara was acutely aware of the eyes watching from behind curtains and through half-open doors. A fresh wave of whispers would follow this encounter as surely as thunder follows lightning. But with Silas's solid, steady presence beside her, she found that she did not care quite as much. There was something about walking next to this man that made the rest of the world recede. His size alone seemed to create a zone of safety around them, a bubble in which the whispers could not penetrate, and the easy rhythm of his stride, unhurried and confident, calmed something inside her that had been vibrating with tension since the moment Helena Caldwell had spoken her name. They did not walk fast. Neither of them seemed inclined to rush, and the main street of Redstone was not long, but they stretched the distance as much as they could without being obvious about it, pausing at unspoken mutual agreement to look at a display in a shop window or to comment on the way the heat made the air ripple above the road. "How long have you lived in the hills, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, partly to break the silence, and partly because she was genuinely curious about this man who had just faced down the most powerful woman in Redstone on her behalf without raising his voice or breaking a sweat. "5 years, give or take. I came west after the war." She glanced up at him. He would have been young then. 20 perhaps, 21. Just a boy really, though. The war had a way of making old men out of boys in a matter of months. "The war I served in the Union Army, Virginia and Tennessee mostly." His voice was carefully neutral, the way a man's voice becomes neutral when he is discussing something that still has the power to cause pain, if he lets it. Alara understood. Texas had been Confederate territory, and the wounds of the Civil War still ran deep in this soil, deep enough that a Union veteran living among former Confederates would need to guard his words as carefully as he guarded his back. After it was over, he continued, "I did not feel much like going home. Ohio did not feel like Ohio anymore. Too many memories, too many empty chairs at tables where friends used to sit. So I headed west and just kept going until I found a place quiet enough for the noise in my head to settle down." "Do you like it living alone in the wilderness?" He considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to bring to everything, turning it over in his mind, the way you might turn over a stone to see what was underneath. "Most days it is good, peaceful. A man can think clearly up there. He can work with his hands and see the results of his labor and know that he built something real." He paused. "But I will not pretend it does not get lonely sometimes. There are evenings when the quiet stops being peaceful and starts being empty, and I find myself talking to my horse just to hear a voice, even if it is my own." They had reached the mercantile. Silas opened the door for her, a small courtesy that spoke of a gentleness entirely at odds with his formidable appearance, and Alara stepped inside, grateful to be out of the public eye. Miss Marsh was upstairs, giving them a brief moment of privacy in the dim, familiar space of the store. "Thank you again, Mr. Blackwood," Alara said, "for what you did at the church. It meant a great deal to me." "Silas," his voice was quiet but firm. "You can call me Silas," she smiled. A real smile, the first one she had felt on her face in longer than she could remember, and it changed her features the way sunlight changes a landscape, warming everything it touched. "Then you should call me Alara." His stern face softened. The lines around his eyes crinkled, and something shifted in his expression, something that hinted at the man he might have been before the war, before the solitude, before he had built walls around himself as solid as the cabin he had built in the hills. Ilara. That is a beautiful name. Before she could respond, the sound of Miss Marsh's footsteps on the stairs broke the moment, and Silas quickly assumed a businesslike demeanor. He placed an order, paid, and left. But before he passed through the doorway, he caught Alara's eye one final time, and the look that passed between them was like a conversation conducted in a language that had no words, a language made entirely of recognition and possibility, and the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that something important had begun. That evening, after the store was closed and supper was cleared and Alara was preparing to climb the narrow stairs to her room, Miss Marsh called her name. Alara stopped. There was something different in the older woman's voice, something strained and uncertain, entirely unlike her usual crisp authority. "Sit down, girl. I need to tell you something." Alara sat in the straight-back chair beside Miss Marsh's desk, the chair where she sat each evening to go over the day's accounts, and she waited. Miss Marsh did not speak immediately. She sat behind her desk with her hands folded, staring at them as though they held some answer she was trying to read. And when she finally raised her eyes, Alara was shocked to see fear in them. Real fear, the kind that goes deeper than any physical threat. The fear of a secret about to be spoken aloud for the first time. "What I am about to tell you," Miss Marsh said slowly, "have never told another living soul. Not in 30 years. And if you repeat it, I will deny every word and put you out on the street before sunrise. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Miss Marsh took a breath that seemed to cost her something immeasurable. "My name is not Gertrude Marsh. It has not been Gertrude Marsh for 30 years. I was born Nellie Boggs in a poorhouse in Galveston, and I spent the first 16 years of my life in that place scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots and being told every single day that I was nothing, that I would always be nothing, that girls like me did not get to have lives, we only got to survive." Alara's breath left her body. She stared at the woman across the desk, this woman she had lived with and worked for and tried so hard to please, and truly saw her for the first time. The severe bun, the rigid posture, the armor of discipline and coldness. It was all protection. Every sharp word, every withering glance, every refusal to show warmth or tenderness was not cruelty. It was the survival strategy of a woman who had spent her entire adult life terrified that someone would see through the mask and find the poorhouse girl hiding underneath. "When I was 16, Miss Marsh continued, her voice low and steady, controlled by sheer force of will, I ran. I had nothing but the dress on my back and a stolen loaf of bread, and the certain knowledge that if I stayed in that place one more day, something inside me would die, that could never be brought back to life. I walked to the next town and the next, and the mouse picking up work, where I could find it sleeping in barns and under bridges, eating whatever I could beg or forage. I was hungry for 2 years, Alara. Not the hunger of missing a meal. The hunger that lives in your bones, that wakes you up at night with your stomach trying to eat itself, that makes you dream of bread the way other girls dream of dresses and dances." Her hands were shaking. She folded them tighter, pressing them together until the knuckles went white. "When I finally came to Redstone, I told people my name was Gertrude Marsh, that I was the daughter of a merchant from San Antonio who had died and left me a small inheritance. I used every penny I had earned and saved and scraped together to buy this mercantile. And I have spent 30 years building this life, this identity, this reputation. No one in this town knows the truth. No one. Not Reverend Harlan, not Helena Caldwell, not any of the women who have bought their flower and their ribbon from me for 3 decades and thought they were dealing with a respectable merchant's daughter." She leaned forward, and her eyes were fierce. "I hired you because I saw myself in you. That look on your face when you stepped down from that wagon, I have seen it in my own mirror every morning for 30 years. The determination, the refusal to be beaten, the terror underneath it all." Ilara's eyes were burning. "Miss Marsh, I had no idea." The older woman held up a hand. "I am not telling you this so you will feel sorry for me. I am telling you this so you will understand what I am about to say." She paused. "Silas Blackwood is a Union veteran in Confederate country. Half the men in this town lost fathers and brothers and sons fighting for the Confederacy. They tolerate Silas because he stays up in his hills and minds his own business. But if you draw attention to his past, if people start looking too closely at the mountain man and the poorhouse girl and asking questions about why they are spending time together, those questions will not stop with you and him. They will come to me. They will come to the store, and everything I have built, everything I have been for 30 years, will be destroyed." Alara sat in silence, absorbing the enormity of what she had just been told. Miss Marsh, Gertrude Marsh, Nellie Boggs, whatever her name truly was, had carried this secret for 3 decades, had built an entire life on the foundation of a lie. And now she was terrified that Alara's connection to Silas might bring the whole structure crashing down. "I understand," Alara said quietly. "Do you?" Miss Marsh's voice cracked. "I am not trying to be cruel, girl. I am trying to protect you, and myself, and him. This town is not kind to people who do not fit the roles it has assigned them. You are the poorhouse girl. He is the mountain man. I am the stern spinster who runs the mercantile. Those are the stories this town has written for us, and stepping outside of them is dangerous." Alara nodded. She understood. She understood better than Miss Marsh could possibly know, because she had spent her entire life being defined by a story she had not chosen, a story written by circumstance and tragedy and the casual cruelty of people who had never bothered to learn the truth. But as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room and lay down on the thin cot and stared at the ceiling, where the shadows gathered like secrets, she could not stop thinking about gray, blue eyes and a deep, quiet voice, and the simple revolutionary statement that everyone who judged her by her circumstances was wrong. She pressed her mother's Bible against her heart and closed her eyes. Miss Marsh was right about the danger. She was right that the town would not understand. She was right that drawing attention could destroy the fragile lives they had each built from nothing. But Alara had spent her entire life being careful, being quiet, being small, and she was beginning to wonder if there was a difference between being safe and being alive. Tomorrow she would go back to work. She would sweep and stock and serve and smile. She would be the poorhouse girl that Redstone expected, dutiful and grateful and invisible. But tonight, in the privacy of her tiny room, she allowed herself to feel what she felt. She allowed herself to remember the warmth of Silas Blackwood's hand brushing hers across the counter. She allowed herself to replay the moment when he had stood in the church doorway and spoken the truth to a room full of people who had forgotten what truth sounded like. And she allowed herself, for the first time since her parents died, to hope that her story was not yet finished, that the best chapters were still to come, that somewhere in the hills north of Redstone, a man with gray-blue eyes was sitting on the porch of a cabin he had built with his own hands, looking out at the stars and thinking of her. The night deepened around her, the sounds of Redstone faded one by one, the saloon falling quiet, the dogs settling the last lamp in the last window, going dark until there was nothing left but the creak of the building's timbers and the distant endless song of the Texas prairie. The wind moving through the grass, like a hand moving through hair, gentle and persistent and full of the promise that tomorrow would come, as it always came, and that it would bring with it whatever she was brave enough to reach for. Alara pressed the Bible closer to her heart and whispered the words her mother had spoken on that last night, the words she had carried through 4 years of darkness and held up like a lantern against the overwhelming night. "Be brave," Rose had said. "Do not give up. God has a plan for you." She had not given up. She had not broken. And somewhere in the place where faith lives, in that deep, unshakable center of the human spirit, that poverty cannot touch and cruelty cannot reach, she believed that her mother was right, that there was a plan, that the poorhouse and the shame and the whispers were not the end of her story, but the beginning of it, the dark first chapter that made everything that followed burn brighter by contrast. She closed her eyes. Sleep came at last, and it was not the fitful, shallow sleep of the poorhouse, the sleep of someone always half awake and listening for trouble. It was deep and still and dreamless. The sleep of someone who has finally, after a very long time, found a reason to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Silas Blackwood began coming to town more frequently after that Sunday at the church, where before he had made the journey from his mountain cabin perhaps once a month. Now he appeared every week, sometimes twice his broad frame and filling the mercantile doorway like a thundercloud settling over a valley. He always had a legitimate reason. He needed an extra sack of flour. He wanted to check whether the new whetstone shipment had arrived. He had beaver pelts to trade and wanted Miss Marsh's fair assessment of their value. But Alara noticed the pattern. His visits coincided precisely with the hours she worked behind the counter. He would linger over his selections, taking an unusual interest in the arrangement of canned goods or the quality of leather goods near the front of the store, and he would find some reason to speak with her, even if just to exchange a few polite words about the weather or the quality of that season's coffee beans. Their conversations grew longer with each visit. Silas told her about a fox den he had discovered near his cabin, about how the kits would tumble over each other in the early morning light. Alara described a passage she had read in her mother's Bible and Silas had listened with such focused attention that she felt perhaps for the first time in years that her thoughts and observations actually mattered to someone. Miss Marsh noticed. Of course she noticed. The older woman had survived 30 years in Redstone by missing nothing, and she watched the growing connection between Alara and the mountain man with an expression that cycled between worry and something that might have been longing, as though she were watching a younger version of herself make a choice she had never been brave enough to make. "That mountain man is circling you like a hawk over a rabbit," Miss Marsh said one evening after Silas had left, her voice sharp as she tallied the day's receipts. "I warned you about this girl. Silas Blackwood is a Union veteran in Confederate country. Every time he walks into this store, half the town is watching through their windows and counting the minutes he spends near you. He is simply being friendly." Miss Marsh, Alara replied, though her cheeks warmed as she straightened the ribbon display. "Friendly." Miss Marsh set down her pen and fixed Alara with a stare that held decades of hard-won wisdom. "I told you my story, girl. I told you what I had to do to build a life here. I changed my name, my history, everything. And it worked because I was careful, because I never gave this town a reason to dig into my past." Her voice dropped. "If you draw too much attention with that man, people will start asking questions, not just about you, about me, about why I took in a poorhouse girl when no one else would. Do you understand what I am saying?" Alara understood perfectly. Miss Marsh was afraid, not just for Alara, but for herself, for the carefully constructed identity she had maintained for 3 decades. The revelation of her own poorhouse origins would destroy everything she had built. "I will be careful, Miss Marsh," Alara said quietly. But she could not stop thinking about Silas, about those gray-blue eyes that held no judgment, no calculation, only a steady warmth that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. About his deep, quiet voice and the way he spoke to her as though her opinions carried weight, as though she were someone worth listening to rather than a charity case to be tolerated. And then Garrett Caldwell arrived. He appeared in the Mercantile on a Tuesday morning, dressed in a fine linen suit with polished boots and a silk cravat that probably cost more than Alara earned in 6 months. He was the son of Edgar Caldwell, who owned the Redstone Bank and held mortgages on half the buildings in town, including, Alara would later learn, the Mercantile itself. Garrett was 24, tall and lean, with sandy hair slicked back from a face that was handsome, in the way a portrait is handsome, all smooth surfaces and careful arrangement. His smile showed perfect teeth, and his manners were impeccable. He tipped his hat to Miss Marsh, complimented the store's organization, and purchased an expensive tin of imported tobacco. Then he turned his attention to Alara. "Miss Whitfield, is it not?" he said, his voice smooth as new silk. "I have heard a great deal about you, the town's newest arrival. I trust you are finding Redstone to your liking." "Yes, sir, thank you," Alara replied, keeping her tone polite but measured. There was something in his eyes she did not trust, a sharpness beneath the charm, a calculating quality that reminded her of the administrators at the poorhouse who had smiled while deciding how little they could feed their charges. "You must allow me to welcome you properly," Garrett continued. "Perhaps a walk after church on Sunday. I know the town quite well and could show you some of its finer points." Before Alara could respond, Miss Marsh intervened. "Miss Whitfield has duties on Sunday, Mr. Caldwell. I am sure you understand." Garrett's smile did not waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Of course, another time then." He tipped his hat once more and left the bell above the door chiming cheerfully in his wake. "Stay away from that one," Miss Marsh said the moment the door closed. "Garrett Caldwell is not what he appears. I had no intention of encouraging him," Alara said. "Good, because the Caldwells do not court poorhouse girls out of the goodness of their hearts. If Garrett is interested in you, it is because he wants something, and whatever that something is, it will not be to your benefit." But Garrett was persistent. He returned the following day, and the day after that, always with some purchase to justify his presence, always finding an excuse to speak with Alara. He brought her a small bouquet of store-bought flowers, which she politely declined. He offered to carry her water from the well, which she also declined. He praised her work ethic, her intelligence, her appearance, laying compliments at her feet, like stepping stones leading towards some destination she had no desire to reach. The contrast between Garrett's polished pursuit and Silas's quiet, respectful attention could not have been starker. Where Garrett was smooth, Silas was straightforward. Where Garrett calculated every word for maximum effect, Silas simply spoke the truth. Where Garrett's presence made Alara uneasy, Silas's presence made her feel safe. On the following Sunday, Silas came to church again. He sat in the back pew across the aisle from Alara, and when their eyes met, there was a warmth in his gaze that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibility. After the service, Silas walked her back toward the mercantile, and they talked for nearly an hour on the front porch, visible to any passerby but lost in their own world. Silas told her about his childhood in Ohio, about growing up on a farm with four brothers, about learning to hunt and trap from his father. He spoke about the war with careful, sparse words, and Alara understood that those memories still haunted him, that the violence he had witnessed had driven him into the wilderness as much as any desire for solitude. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. "To Ohio? There is nothing for me there," he said, his gray-blue eyes distant for a moment. "My brothers scattered after the war. The farm was sold. The boy who left Ohio did not survive Virginia and Tennessee. Someone else came back, someone who needed space and silence to figure out who he was going to be. And have you figured it out?" He looked at her, then really looked at her, and the corners of his stern mouth softened into something that was almost a smile. "I am beginning to." Alara felt her breath catch. She wanted to tell him that she understood that she too was trying to figure out who she was going to be, that the girl who had scrubbed floors in the Houston poorhouse was not the woman she intended to become. But before she could speak, a shadow fell across the porch. Garrett Caldwell stood in the street watching them. He was not smiling. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his tone pleasant but his eyes cold. "Mr. Blackwood, how charming to see the two of you enjoying this fine afternoon. Mr. Caldwell." Silas acknowledged, his voice neutral. Garrett lingered for a moment, his gaze moving between them, cataloging something. Then he touched the brim of his hat and walked on, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that made Alara's stomach tighten with unease. The following week brought the confrontation she had been dreading. Garrett came into the mercantile on Thursday afternoon when the store was busy with customers. He was dressed in his finest suit, and he carried himself with the deliberate air of a man about to make a public performance. Alara felt the shift in the room instantly, the way conversations paused and heads turned. "Miss Whitfield," Garrett said, his voice pitched to Carrie, "I have come to make you an offer that I believe will change your circumstances considerably." He paused for effect, making sure every ear in the store was tuned to his frequency. "I would like to ask for your hand in marriage." The silence that followed was absolute. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. Every customer in the store was staring, weighting the air thick with expectation. "Mr. Caldwell," Alara managed her voice barely above a whisper, "I am honored by your attention, but I cannot accept." "Cannot?" Garrett's ivory smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Or will not. I do not believe we would suit each other, sir." "I see." His tone had shifted, the silk sliding away to reveal something harder beneath. "You would refuse the son of the most prominent family in Redstone, a man who could give you everything you have never had, in favor of what exactly? Spending your days scrubbing floors in a mercantile? Or perhaps you have your sights set on a different kind of life entirely, one in a cabin on some god-forsaken mountain, with a man who talks to bears more than people." Gasps rippled through the store. Alara's hands trembled, but she held her ground. "My reasons are my own, Mr. Caldwell." Garrett stared at her for a long, terrible moment, and she saw something in his eyes that frightened her more than all the whispers and judgment she had endured since arriving in Redstone. It was not anger exactly. It was the cold, calculating fury of a man who was not accustomed to being denied. "Very well," he said softly, and left without another word. The repercussions came swiftly. 2 days later, Miss Marsh called Alara into the back room, and the older woman's face was ashen. "Edgar Caldwell came to see me this morning," Miss Marsh said, her voice barely steady. "He holds the mortgage on this building, Alara, on everything I own. He told me very politely that if I continue to employ you, he will call in the loan. I would lose the store. I would lose everything." Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "He cannot do that. He can. He owns the bank. The mortgage terms allow him to call the loan due at any time with 30 days' notice. I could not possibly raise the funds." Miss Marsh's eyes were bright with tears she was too proud to shed. "I am so sorry, girl. You have been a fine worker, the best I have ever had, but I cannot lose this store. It is all I have. It is the life I built when I had nothing just like you. I understand, Alara whispered, though. Understanding did not ease the devastation. She was being cast out again, just as she had been cast out of the poorhouse, just as she had been cast out of every place she had ever tried to call home. She packed her small bundle of possessions with numb hands. 2 dresses, a spare pair of stockings, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible. The same pitiful collection she had arrived with unchanged, as though the weeks of hard work and hope had meant nothing at all. Miss Marsh pressed a month's wages into her hand. Take this. It is the least I can do. Thank you, Miss Marsh, for everything. The older woman's composure finally cracked. She pulled Alara into a brief, fierce embrace, the first physical affection she had shown since Alara's arrival. You are worth 10 of that Caldwell boy, she whispered. Do not let them break you. Alara stepped out onto the main street of Redstone with her bundle in her arms and nowhere to go. The afternoon sun beat down on her like a judgment, and she could feel the eyes of the town upon her, the whispers starting up again, like a chorus that had merely been waiting for its cue. She stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt like an eternity, trying to think, trying to plan, trying not to let the despair swallow her whole. She had survived the poorhouse. She had survived the whispers and the scorn. She would survive this too. But standing in that dusty street with the weight of her entire life in her arms, she had never felt more alone. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Silas Blackwood came riding down the main street on his big sorrel mare, riding hard dust billowing behind him like a cape. Someone had ridden up to his cabin to tell him, though Alara would never learn who. He pulled the horse to a stop directly in front of her and swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, his face set in an expression that was equal parts fury and determination. Silas, what are you doing here? He looked at her, looked at the bundle in her arms, looked at the townspeople watching from doorways and windows, and then he spoke in a voice that carried clear and strong down the length of Redstone's main street. She is coming to my house now. The whispers exploded. From every doorway, every window, every corner of the town, the murmurs erupted like a flock of startled birds. She is going with the mountain man. The poorhouse girl is going up to his cabin. What will people say? But Silas did not care what people said. He took the bundle from Alara's arms and secured it to his saddle, then turned to face her with those steady gray-blue eyes. My cabin is not much, he said quietly for her ears alone. But it is safe and it is warm and no one will bother you there. This is not a proposal, Alara. This is a friend offering shelter when you need it. Nothing more unless you want it to be. Alara looked at this man, this rough mountain man in his buckskin trousers and homespun shirt, who had ridden 3 hours down from the hills because he had heard she was in trouble, who was standing in the middle of a hostile town and offering her his home without asking for anything in return, and she felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she had built long ago in the poorhouse to protect herself from hope. Thank you, she said. Yes, I will come. Silas helped her onto the horse, then led the mare by the reins, walking beside her through the length of Redstone's main street while the entire town watched. It should have been humiliating. Instead, it felt like a triumph because Alara was not running away. She was walking towards something, toward a man who saw her worth when no one else would. The journey to Silas's cabin took 3 hours, winding through rugged terrain that grew wilder and more beautiful as they climbed. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that did not require words. The cabin was larger than she had expected, solidly built from logs Silas had cut, and shaped himself with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Inside, everything was clean and orderly. Silas showed her to a small room he used for storage, which he quickly cleared out, setting up a cot with fresh blankets. You sleep here, he said. I will sleep on the porch. There is a bar on the inside of the door. Silas, you do not need to do that. Yes, I do. His face was earnest, almost fierce in its sincerity. Your reputation has taken enough damage today because of me. I will not give anyone cause to say I took advantage of your situation. You are my guest, Alara. Nothing more unless and until you decide otherwise. In the days that followed, Alara discovered who Silas Blackwood truly was beneath his rough exterior. He was a man of deep intelligence who had taught himself to read and write despite limited schooling. He spoke thoughtfully about everything from politics to philosophy to the patterns of animal behavior he observed in the wilderness. He had a dry, unexpected humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh despite everything. He was also unfailingly respectful. He rose early to have coffee ready when she woke. He taught her which wild plants were edible and which were medicinal, pointing out herbs and roots with the patience of a born teacher. He asked her opinions and listened to her answers with genuine interest. He treated her as an equal a partner in the daily work of survival, and she found that this life, hard as it was, satisfied something in her soul that the mercantile never had. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun painted the hills in shades of amber, and rose, Alara asked the question that had been growing in her mind. Tell me about the war, Silas, not the battles. Tell me what it cost you. He was quiet for a long time, so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. It cost me the ability to sleep through the night. It cost me 4 years of my life and most of my faith in humanity. I watched boys die, Alara. Boys younger than you, bleeding in the mud, calling for their mothers. I killed men who had done nothing wrong except be born on the wrong side of a line someone drew on a map. He paused. When it ended, I tried to go home, but Ohio did not feel like home anymore. Nowhere did. So I kept moving west until I found a place quiet enough that the ghosts could not find me. And did they stop, the ghosts? Most of them. But I think some ghosts you carry with you, no matter how far you run. You just learn to live alongside them. She reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers thick and strong, but his grip was achingly gentle. I have ghosts too, she said. The poorhouse, the day they told me my parents were dead. The years of feeling invisible, of being treated as less than nothing. You were never less than nothing, he said fiercely. I know that now, she replied. You helped me see it. They sat together as the stars emerged hand in hand, and something settled between them, an understanding that went deeper than words, a recognition that they had each been broken by life and were choosing together to become whole again. 3 weeks after Ilara arrived at the cabin, the sky turned ugly. Silas had been watching the weather for days, his experienced eyes reading signs that most people would miss. The unusual humidity, the way the birds had gone silent, the strange yellow-green tinge to the horizon. He had seen weather like this before, and it had not ended well. Storm is coming, he told Alara over breakfast. A bad one. We need to warn the town. They will not listen to you, Alara said, remembering how the townsfolk treated him. Maybe not, but we have to try. They rode down together, arriving in Redstone just before noon. Silas went door to door on the north end of town while Alara took the south. Most people listened to Alara with varying degrees of skepticism, but at least they listened. Silas fared worse. At the Caldwell residence, Helena Caldwell opened the door, took one look at him, and shut it in his face without a word. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the wind was picking up fast. Alara met Silas back at the mercantile just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Best we can do, Silas said, breathing hard. Now we need shelter. The mercantile has a cellar, Alara said. Miss Marsh showed me. They had barely reached the cellar door when the storm hit with a violence that defied description. The wind screamed, rain hammered the building like 1,000 fists, and somewhere above them, something massive struck the roof with a crash that shook the walls. Silas pulled Alara down the narrow stairs, slamming the heavy cellar door behind them. In the small, damp cellar lit only by a single lantern, Silas positioned himself between Alara and the stairs. His body was taut with alertness, every muscle ready for a warrior's instinct that had never fully left him. Are you all right? He asked, raising his voice over the storm's fury. I am frightened, she admitted. Silas moved closer, not inappropriately, but near enough that his presence was a solid, reassuring wall between her and the chaos above. Fear is honest, he said. But I promise you, Alara, I will not let anything happen to you. She believed him, completely and without reservation. She believed this man who barely knew her, who owed her nothing, who had ridden 3 hours to rescue her from a hostile town and was now standing guard over her in a cellar while the world tried to tear itself apart above them. Silas, she said, and something in her voice made him look at her with those piercing eyes. Whatever happens after this storm, I want you to know that you are the best person I have ever met, the kindest, the most decent. Alara, he began, let me finish. The world told me I was nothing, a poorhouse girl, a charity case, someone to be pitied and avoided. But you looked at me and saw something else. You saw me, and I do not know what will come tomorrow, but I know that meeting you changed it everything. He reached through the darkness and found her hand wrapping it entirely in both of his. The lantern flickered, throwing their shadows huge and wavering against the cellar walls. And above them, the storm screamed as though it meant to tear the world apart and start again from scratch. When I came back from the war, Silas said, his voice just loud enough to reach her through the din, I thought I was done with caring about anything. I thought if I went far enough into the hills and stayed quiet enough, the world would forget about me, and I could forget about it. And it worked for a while. 5 years I lived like that, and I told myself it was enough. He paused, and his grip on her hand tightened. Then I walked into a mercantile and saw a girl with fire in her eyes, and everything I had built to protect myself just crumbled. You ruined my solitude, Alara Whitfield, and I have never been more grateful for anything in my life. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and felt his arm come around her. In the darkness with destruction raging above them, she felt safer than she had ever felt in her 18 years of living. The storm raged for nearly an hour. When it finally subsided and Silas cautiously pushed open the cellar door, they emerged into a changed Redstone. The main street was a wasteland of debris. Broken boards, shattered glass, and overturned carts smashed beyond recognition. The church steeple leaned at a dangerous angle. The saloon's front windows were blown out entirely. Trees had been uprooted and flung across the road like discarded toys. And in the middle of the street, Helena Caldwell stood beside the ruins of her prized greenhouse, weeping openly, her fine dress muddied and torn. But the revelation that truly shook the town came within the hour. As people emerged from their shelters and began to assess the damage, a terrible realization spread like wildfire through the battered streets. Garrett Caldwell was gone. Not injured, not trapped beneath rubble. Gone. His horse was missing from the stable. His room at the Caldwell house had been hastily emptied of valuables. He had fled Redstone before the storm hit, taking what he could carry and leaving his own mother to face the fury alone. Old Pete from the livery stable confirmed it. He had seen Garrett saddling his horse in a panic just as the sky turned green, stuffing saddlebags with clothes and his father's silver pocket watch. When Pete had asked where he was going, Garrett had snarled at him to mind his own business and ridden south at a gallop. South, away from the storm, away from the town, away from every person who had ever depended on him or believed in him. The discovery hit the town like a second storm. Edgar Caldwell, the banker, stood white-faced in the ruins of his front porch while his wife sobbed. Their son, their golden boy, the man who had publicly proposed to a poorhouse girl and then used his family's power to destroy her livelihood when she dared refuse him, had abandoned them all at the first sign of real danger. And Silas Blackwood, the mountain man, the Union veteran, the outsider they had treated with suspicion and scorn for 5 years, was in the middle of the street pulling debris off the road, checking on neighbors, lifting a fallen beam from the schoolhouse entrance with his bare hands so the children huddled inside could be freed. Alara worked beside him. They moved together through the town, with wordless coordination, clearing wreckage, bandaging cuts, checking on the elderly and the infirm. Alara used the knowledge of medicinal herbs she had begun learning from Silas to make poultices for the injured from plants growing in the churchyard. As the sun began its descent, casting long orange light across Redstone's battered streets, Helena Caldwell approached them. Her face was tear-streaked, her pride in ruins as surely as her greenhouse. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Whitfield, her voice cracked. You tried to warn us. You came to our door, and I shut it in your face. My son, my Garrett, he ran. She could barely get the words out. But you stayed, you both stayed, and helped after everything this town has done to you. What matters is that you are safe, Mrs. Caldwell, Silas said simply. I was wrong, Helena whispered. About you, about her, about everything. She turned to Alara with eyes full of a shame that went far deeper than a ruined greenhouse. Miss Whitfield, I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express. I was cruel to you. I judged you for where you came from instead of who you are, and I am deeply, deeply sorry. Alara took the older woman's hands. I forgive you, Mrs. Caldwell, truly. That evening, the town gathered in the damaged church to organize repairs. And for the first time since Alara had arrived in Redstone, she was not an outsider. People thanked her for the storm warning, asked after her well-being, nodded to her with genuine respect. Miss Marsh caught her eye across the room and gave a small, proud smile. After the meeting, Silas walked with Alara through the debris-littered streets. The moon had risen full and silver, washing the damaged town in a light that somehow made it look not destroyed, but renewed, ready to be rebuilt. They stopped at the edge of town where the road curved north toward the hills. Silas turned to face her, and in the moonlight, his weathered face held an expression of such raw vulnerability that it took Alara's breath away. This man who had survived war and wilderness, who could face down a bear without flinching, looked terrified. Alara, he said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. I know I am just a mountain man. I live in a cabin in the hills, and I hunt and trap for a living, and I talk to my horse more than I talk to people. I do not have money or land worth much or a family name that means anything. I am not what anyone would call a good prospect. Silas, she began, let me say this because if I stop, I may never find the courage again. He took a breath that shuddered through his massive frame. I love you, Alara Whitfield. I have loved you since the day I walked into that mercantile and saw you standing there with your chin up and fire in your eyes, refusing to let the world beat you down. You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you deserve every good thing this world has to offer. He reached into his pocket and produced a ring simple and hand-forged a band of silver he had hammered and shaped himself. It was not elegant or expensive. It was honest and strong, like the man who had made it. Will you marry me? Will you come to my house and make it our home? Alara looked at the ring, looked at this extraordinary man standing before her with his heart laid bare, and felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so fierce it burned. Yes, she said. Yes, Silas, I will marry you. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled despite their strength, and then he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his broad chest so tightly she could feel his heartbeat racing beneath the rough fabric of his shirt. She is coming to my house now, he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with wonder. You are really going to be my wife. I really am, Alara said, laughing through her tears, and I have never been more certain of anything in my life. They were married the following Sunday in the small white church of Redstone, with its damaged steeple still leaning at an angle that Reverend Harlan called a reminder of humility and God's sense of humor. The whole town turned out, filling the pews to capacity, and if there were those who still harbored private judgments about a poorhouse girl marrying a mountain man, they had the grace to keep those judgments to themselves. The days before the wedding had passed in a flurry of unexpected generosity. Helena Caldwell, true to her reformed nature, donated fabric from her own stores, a beautiful bolt of pale blue cotton that she insisted Alara use for her wedding dress. Other women contributed what they could. Lace for trim from old Mrs. Pemberton, a length of white ribbon from the young widow Clara Stockton, a pair of ivory gloves carefully preserved from someone else's wedding years before offered by the schoolteacher Miss Hannigan. Alara sewed the dress herself in the evenings by lamplight, sitting in the main room of Silas's cabin, while he worked nearby shaping something from wood that he would not let her see. Her needle moved through the pale blue fabric with steady precision, each stitch carrying a kind of prayer for this new life, for this man, for the future she had never dared to imagine during those long years of scrubbing floors and mending other people's clothes. Blue for her new beginning, blue for the vast Texas sky, blue for Silas's remarkable eyes. On the morning of the wedding, Alara dressed with trembling hands in the small room that had been hers for the past month. The dress fit perfectly, the blue fabric bringing out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. She pinned her dark blonde hair up in a simple style and smoothed the borrowed gloves over her fingers. Miss Marsh appeared in the doorway. The older woman had ridden out to the cabin at dawn, claiming she needed to deliver some supplies, but Alara knew the real reason. Gertrude Marsh stood there in her best dress, her iron gray hair neatly pinned, and for the first time since Alara had known her, the stern lines of her face softened into something that looked remarkably like tenderness. You look lovely, girl, she said. Truly lovely. Thank you, Miss Marsh, for everything, for giving me work when no one else would, for telling me your story, for being braver than you think you are. Miss Marsh blinked rapidly and cleared her throat. Do not make an old woman weep before breakfast, she said gruffly. But she crossed the room and took Alara's hands, squeezing them tightly. You have done well, child. Your mother would be proud. The church was full when Alara arrived. She saw the Caldwells in the front pew, Helena dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Edgar sat stiffly beside her, looking diminished since his son's departure, but present, which was more than many had expected of him. She saw the shopkeepers and the farmers and their dogs, the same faces that had whispered about her and turned away from her for months. She saw Miss Marsh settle into a pew near the front, her expression daring anyone to comment. But Alara had eyes only for Silas. He stood at the altar in a new suit that must have cost him a season's worth of pelts. The dark fabric strained slightly across his massive shoulders, and his long hair had been trimmed and neatly combed, his face clean-shaven for perhaps the first time since the war. He looked almost like a different man, except for those eyes, those extraordinary gray-blue eyes that locked onto Alara the moment she appeared in the doorway, and filled with a love so naked and overwhelming that half the congregation had to look away, not from disapproval, but from the sheer intimacy of the emotion. Reverend Harlan performed the ceremony with warmth and a sincerity that transcended the usual formalities. When it came time for the vows, Silas's deep voice was steady as bedrock. I, Silas Blackwood, take you, Alara Whitfield, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to protect you, to provide for you, to cherish you in sickness and in health and hardship and in plenty, and to love you with everything I have and everything I am for all the days of my life. Alara's voice shook, but it did not falter. I, Alara Whitfield, take you, Silas Blackwood, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you, to support you, to honor you, and to love you faithfully and completely for all the days of my life. When Reverend Harlan pronounced them husband and wife, Silas cupped Alara's face in his enormous calloused hands with a tenderness that seemed impossible for such strength and kissed her. The congregation erupted in applause that was genuine and joyful, and Alara felt tears running down her cheeks as she smiled against her husband's lips. The reception in the church hall was the finest gathering Redstone had seen in years. There was food in abundance, dishes contributed by families across the town. Someone produced a fiddle and someone else a banjo, and there was music and dancing and laughter that rang out across the Texas evening. People congratulated them with warmth that carried no undertone of judgment, and Helena Caldwell embraced Alara and whispered, "Welcome to Redstone, dear. Truly welcome at last." As the sun began to set, Silas helped Alara into his wagon, now loaded with her few possessions and supplies for their life together. The townspeople gathered to see them off, waving and calling out blessings. "She is going to his house now." Alara heard someone murmur, but the words carried only wonder and warmth, like the closing line of a fairy tale. The journey home took 3 hours, the wagon rattling through increasingly wild terrain as the hills rose around them like protective shoulders. Alara leaned against Silas's arm, watching the last light fade from the sky and the first stars appear, and she felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. "Are you ready?" Silas asked as the cabin came into view, its windows dark, waiting to be filled with light. "I am ready for anything," she said, "as long as I am with you." Silas lifted her from the wagon and carried her across the threshold, and they stood together in the dim main room, breathing in the familiar scents of pine smoke and coffee and leather. Then Silas lit the lanterns, and the cabin bloomed with warm golden light, revealing the home he had prepared for her. Everything was meticulously clean and arranged with care. Fresh wildflowers stood in a jar on the table. The hearth was laid with kindling ready to be lit, and on the bed in their room a quilt that made Alara's breath catch in her throat. "I made it," Silas admitted, looking embarrassed. "Last winter, the stitching is not fine, I know. My hands are not built for needlework. But I wanted you to have something made with care." The quilt was indeed somewhat clumsy in its construction, the stitches uneven in places, but the pattern had been carefully chosen, stars and diamonds in shades of blue and cream and gold, and the hours of painstaking work were evident in every imperfect, heartfelt stitch. The image of this powerful, rough-hewn man, sitting by firelight and laboriously pushing a needle through fabric, made Alara fall in love with him all over again. "It is the most beautiful quilt I have ever seen," she said, and she meant every word. Their first weeks of marriage passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Living in the wilderness required constant effort, but it was satisfying in a way that Alara's life had never been before. Every task had purpose, every labor bore visible results. Silas taught her to tend the vegetable garden behind the cabin, to preserve meat, to make tallow candles, to read the weather and the land. Alara brought her own considerable skills to their partnership. She was an excellent cook who could make delicious meals from the simplest ingredients. She organized their supplies with the same precision she had brought to Miss Marsh's inventory system. She mended Silas's clothes, made new ones, and kept meticulous records of their stores. But beyond the practical necessities, there was genuine joy. Silas would come in from checking his traps to find Alara singing as she worked some half-remembered melody her mother had loved, and he would stop in the doorway just to listen, his face soft with a contentment that smoothed away the war's lingering shadows. Alara would wake in the early morning to find that Silas had already risen and made coffee that he had let her sleep while he tended to the hardest morning chores. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch watching the sun descend behind the hills in colors that no painting could capture. They talked about everything and nothing. They sat in comfortable silence. They held hands and felt the simple, extraordinary miracle of having found each other against every conceivable odd. Once a month, they made the journey into Redstone for supplies and to attend church. The town had changed in the wake of the storm and the revelation of Garrett's cowardice. People greeted Silas and Alara with genuine warmth, and if old prejudices still lingered in some hearts, they were being steadily worn away by the evidence of two good people living honest, decent lives. Helena Caldwell had become an unlikely friend, often pressing cuttings from her rebuilt greenhouse into Alara's hands, along with recipes and gardening advice. Miss Marsh maintained her gruff exterior, but always had a special smile reserved for Alara, and once, when she thought no one was watching, Alara saw the older woman reach out and briefly touch the fabric of her former employee's dress with an expression of wistful pride. 6 months into their marriage on a crisp November morning, Alara woke feeling queasy. She barely made it outside before being sick, and when she returned to the cabin pale and shaking, Silas looked at her with an expression of combined concern and dawning incredulous hope. "Alara," he asked carefully, "are you—" She pressed her hand to her stomach, counting back the weeks, and felt a surge of joy so overwhelming that it left her dizzy. "I believe I am with child." Silas let out a sound that was half laugh and half prayer, and crossed the room in two enormous strides, gathering her into his arms and holding her as though she were made of glass and gold and miracles. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby. I believe so. It is still early, but every sign is there." He dropped to his knees before her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach, and Alara felt tears slide down her cheeks as she watched this strong-weathered man brought low by happiness. "Thank you," he whispered, "for this gift, for choosing me, for making my life worth living." "Thank you for seeing me," she replied, running her fingers through his dark hair. "When all the world saw was a poor house girl, you saw someone worth loving." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Silas became almost comically protective, hovering over Alara like a massive, anxious mother hen, refusing to let her carry anything heavier than a coffee pot, insisting she rest whenever she showed the slightest sign of fatigue. He made more frequent trips into Redstone to ensure she had proper food and whatever supplies the expectant mothers of the town recommended. He spent his evenings by the fire, his large hands carefully shaping smooth pine wood into a cradle, every surface sanded and polished until it gleamed. He carved small animals along the headboard, a deer, a rabbit, a fox, the creatures of their mountain home, standing guard over the child who would sleep there. Helena Caldwell organized a quilting bee, and the women of Redstone created a stunning baby quilt, each square, sewn by a different hand with care and good wishes. When they presented it to Alara on one of her monthly visits to town, she wept openly, overwhelmed by how far she had come from the girl they had once whispered about and shunned. But as spring arrived and Alara's belly grew round and full, Silas's joy became increasingly shadowed by fear. He tried to hide it, but Alara knew him too well by now. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened when she mentioned the birth, in the restless pacing he did at night, when he thought she was sleeping, in the way his hand would sometimes rest on her belly, with an expression that was equal parts wonder and dread. She finally confronted him one night as they lay in bed together, her back pressed against his chest, his arm curved protectively over her swollen belly. "Tell me what is frightening you," she said gently. He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "My mother died in childbirth, with my youngest brother. I was 12 years old. I heard her screaming, and then I heard silence, and the silence was worse." His arm tightened around her. I cannot lose you, Alara. I have survived war and wilderness and years of loneliness, but I could not survive losing you. She turned in his arms to face him, cupping his face in her hands. Listen to me, Silas Blackwood. I am strong. Our baby is healthy. I can feel it is strong and active, just like its father. I will not pretend there is no risk because we both know frontier life holds no guarantees. But I have faith. Faith in my body, faith in our child, and faith that God did not bring us through everything we have survived just to take us from each other now. You cannot know that for certain. No, but I can believe it with every fiber of my being, and I need you to believe it with me. He pulled her close and held her, and she felt the tension slowly leave his body. Not completely. The fear would not fully release him until it was over, but enough that they could face what was coming together. Silas insisted on bringing Mrs. Prudence Finley, the midwife who attended most births in the area, to the cabin 2 weeks before Lara's expected time. Mrs. Finley was a stout, no-nonsense woman of 60 who had delivered more babies than she could count, and her calm, competent presence eased some of Silas's anxiety, though he still paced the cabin like a caged mountain lion whenever Alara so much as winced. Alara went into labor on a warm June morning, the kind of morning when the hills were green and lush and the air smelled of wildflowers and possibility. The contractions began mild and far apart, giving her time to prepare mentally for the ordeal ahead. Silas was a wreck. He paced, he sat, he stood, he paced again. He brought Alara water she had not asked for and blankets she did not need, and asked her every 30 seconds if she was all right. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Finley finally said with the authority of a woman who had been managing anxious fathers for 4 decades, if you do not go outside and find something useful to do with yourself, I will bar this door and not open it again until the child is in your arms. Silas looked torn between obedience and rebellion. Alara reached for his hand and squeezed it. She is right, my love. I need to focus, and I cannot do that if I am worried about you wearing holes in our floor. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. You are the strongest woman I know. You can do this. I know I can. Now go. The labor lasted all day and into the evening. It was hard and painful and exhausting, each contraction a wave that threatened to pull her under. Mrs. Finley guided her through every stage with steady encouragement and practical wisdom. But as the hours stretched on, something changed. Mrs. Finley's expression tightened. Her hands moved with sudden urgency. She did not speak for a long moment, and in that silence, Alara felt the first real stab of fear. What is it? Alara gasped between contractions. The cord. Mrs. Finley said, her voice carefully controlled. It is wrapped around the baby's neck. I need you to listen to me very carefully, child. When I tell you to push, you push with everything you have. When I tell you to stop, you stop immediately. Do you understand? Yes. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Finley called out sharply. The door flew open. Silas was there in an instant, his face white. I need your hands, Mrs. Finley told him. Wash them. Now, do exactly as I say. Do not panic. Your wife and child need you steady. Alara watched as the two most powerful forces in her life, the midwife's experience and her husband's desperate love, converged on the single purpose of bringing their child safely into the world. Silas's massive hands, hands that could fell a tree and gentle a wild horse, followed Mrs. Finley's terse instructions with absolute precision. Now push, Mrs. Finley commanded. Alara bore down with everything she had, calling on every reserve of strength she possessed. She thought of the poorhouse, the shame, the whispers, the loneliness. She had survived all of that. She would survive this. Stop. Hold still. Do not push. The hardest thing she had ever done was not pushing in that moment, fighting against every instinct in her body, while Mrs. Finley's skilled fingers worked to free the cord from around the baby's neck. Again. Push now, hard. Alara screamed a sound she did not know she was capable of making and pushed with the last of her strength, and suddenly there was a rushing sensation, and then the most beautiful sound in the world, the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn, filling the cabin with life. A boy, Mrs. Finley announced, her voice thick with emotion despite her decades of professional composure. A big, healthy boy. Silas made a sound that Alara had never heard from him before, something between a sob and a prayer. And then Mrs. Finley was placing the baby in Alara's arms, and she looked down at her son for the first time. He was red-faced and furious. his dark hair slick, his tiny fists waving at the injustice of being thrust into the cold world. He was the most beautiful thing Ilara had ever seen. "Let me hold him," Silas whispered, and Ilara placed their son into his father's enormous trembling hands. Silas cradled the infant against his broad chest, and the baby stopped crying, almost immediately, soothed by the deep, steady heartbeat beneath him. Father and son stared at each other, and Ilara watched Silas's face transform with an expression of such pure, overwhelming wonder that she knew she would carry this image in her heart for the rest of her life. "Hello, little one," Silas murmured. "I am your papa. I have been waiting a very long time to meet you." "What shall we name him?" Ilara asked. Silas looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was thinking if you are willing about the name Josiah, after my father. Josiah Thomas Blackwood. Thomas for your father's middle name." "Yes, Josiah Thomas Blackwood." Ilara repeated, tasting the name. "It is strong, it is perfect." Mrs. Finley stayed for another week, helping Ilara recover and teaching her the finer points of caring for a newborn. Young Josiah proved to be a hardy, demanding baby with his father's powerful lungs and his mother's stubborn determination. Silas rose at every cry during the night, insisting that Ilara sleep while he paced the cabin with his son, cradled against his chest, singing old army songs in a surprisingly sweet baritone that seemed to soothe the infant better than anything else. The seasons turned, and with them, the Blackwood family grew. 2 years after Josiah's birth, Ilara gave birth to a daughter they named Willa June, a fierce, bright-eyed girl who inherited her father's love of the outdoors and her mother's quiet determination. She could track game almost as well as Silas by the time she was 10, though she also showed a startling talent for sketching the wildlife. She observed, filling journals with remarkably detailed drawings of birds and deer and the fox kits that played near the cabin each spring. 2 years after Willa June came another son, Ezra, their quietest child, thoughtful and gentle, who loved books with a passion that delighted Ilara and bemused Silas. The boy would sit for hours on the cabin porch, lost in whatever volume he could get his hands on, and Silas built him a small desk of his own, sanded smooth, and placed by the window where the light was best. Silas built additions onto the cabin to accommodate their growing family, and the small structure that had once housed a solitary man became a home alive with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of 3 children discovering the world. And Silas kept his word about giving the children opportunities beyond the wilderness. He purchased a piece of land just outside Redstone and built a second, smaller cabin where the family would spend autumns and winters close enough to town for the children to attend school and for Ilara to maintain the friendships she had built. Springs and summers they spent in the hills in the original cabin, where it had all begun, where Silas taught his children the skills of the wilderness, and Ilara gathered the medicinal herbs that had become her calling. For Ilara had become known throughout Redstone and the surrounding settlements for her knowledge of herbal remedies. She had taught herself through careful study and experimentation, creating salves and tinctures that eased everything from rheumatism to colic to fever. People came from miles around seeking her help, and she never turned anyone away, never charged more than people could afford, because she remembered what it felt like to be desperate and alone, and to have no one willing to extend a hand. The years flowed by like the creek beside the cabin, steady and sustaining. Josiah grew tall and strong with his father's build and his mother's keen intelligence. He dreamed of becoming a doctor, inspired by the traveling physician who visited Redstone twice a year, and Silas and Ilara saved every spare penny to make that dream possible. Willa June's sketches attracted the attention of a visiting artist from Austin who declared the girl had genuine talent and arranged for her to receive proper instruction. Ezra consumed every book in Redstone's small lending library and began writing stories of his own tales of adventure and courage that bore a suspicious resemblance to his parents' history, though he always insisted they were entirely fictional. And then on a quiet afternoon, 20 years after a terrified girl had climbed down from a wagon in Redstone, with nothing but shame and a threadbare shawl, the circle completed itself. They were older now, Silas and Ilara. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his movements, while still sure and strong, had slowed with the years. Her face carried the lines of age and laughter and Texas sun, and her hands, once smooth, bore the marks of 2 decades of hard, honest work. But the love between them had never dimmed. If anything, time had deepened it the way a river deepens its channel, wearing away everything unnecessary until only the essential remains. Josiah had become a respected doctor in Dallas, fulfilling the dream he had carried since childhood. Willa June had married a surveyor named Daniel Holt and moved to Colorado, where she sketched the Rocky Mountains and sent home drawings that Alara pinned to every available wall. Ezra had opened a bookstore in Redstone, right on the same main street where his mother had once stood with nowhere to go, and was raising a family of his own. On that quiet afternoon, Alara was in her garden behind the hill cabin, tending the herbs and vegetables with the practiced ease of long experience. Silas was nearby repairing a section of fence. The air smelled of sage and warm earth, and the only sounds were birdsong and the gentle gurgle of the creek. A rider appeared on the trail below, picking her way carefully up the rocky path on a tired-looking horse. As she drew closer, Alara could see that she was young, perhaps 17 or 18, with clothes that were worn thin and patched in multiple places. Her face was gaunt with hunger, and her eyes held an expression that Alara recognized with a clarity that cut straight to her heart. It was the look of someone who was afraid to hope but could not quite help it. The girl dismounted and stood uncertainly at the edge of the clearing, twisting her hands in her skirt. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Lenore Pruitt. I am looking for work. Someone in Redstone told me you folks might need help with the garden and preserving for winter. I do not have much experience, but I am a hard worker, and I learn quick. I will do anything. Please." Alara and Silas exchanged a long look across the clearing. In that look passed 20 years of shared history of struggle and love, and the bone-deep understanding that comes from building a life together through storms and silence and everything in between. They both saw what stood before them, not just a hungry girl looking for work, but an echo, a mirror, a chance to pass forward at the grace that had once been extended to them. "You must be exhausted," Alara said gently, crossing the yard to take the girl's trembling hands. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" Lenore's eyes filled with tears. "I do not rightly remember, ma'am." "Well, that will not do. Come inside. We have stew on the fire and fresh bread. We will talk about work after you have eaten and rested." As Lenore followed Alara toward the cabin, Silas fell into step beside his wife and caught her hand, squeezing it gently. Their eyes met, and she saw in his face the same emotion she felt in her own chest, a fierce aching tenderness for this girl who reminded them both of where they had started. That evening, after Lenore had been fed and shown to the small guest room, after the girl had fallen asleep almost before her head touched the pillow, Alara and Silas sat together on their porch one more time. The sun was setting in brilliant shades of orange and copper, and rose painting the Texas hills in colors that still took Alara's breath away after all these years. "She reminds me of you," Silas said quietly, that look in her eyes. Like she has been told so many times that she is nothing that she has almost started to believe it. "I know," Alara replied. "I see myself in her, lost and scared but trying so hard not to show it." "You will help her." It was not a question, but Alara answered anyway. "Of course. How could I not? Someone once told me that judging people by their circumstances rather than their character was wrong. Someone stood up for a poorhouse girl when the whole town had written her off. I learned from that example, Silas. I learned that one act of faith in another person's worth can change the course of a life." He pulled her close, and she leaned into his warmth, into the solid, beloved shape of this man who had been her shelter and her strength for 20 years. That week, Helena Caldwell, now elderly but still sharp and formidable, organized a celebration at the Redstone Church Hall to mark the 20th anniversary of Alara's arrival in town. The hall was decorated with wildflowers from the hills, and it seemed like the entire county had turned out. Helena stood before the gathering, her voice carrying with surprising strength across the crowded room. 20 years ago, a girl arrived in this town from the Houston poorhouse, and we whispered about her like she was something to be ashamed of. We judged her before we knew her. We shut our doors to her. We treated her as though poverty were a disease she might spread to our clean, respectable lives. She paused, letting the silence settle. And then a mountain man from the hills showed us what real character looks like. He stood up in this very church and reminded us that judging people by their circumstances rather than who they are is the worst kind of cowardice. Alara Whitfield Blackwood came to us with nothing but courage and dignity, and she gave this town more than it ever gave her. She nursed our sick, she taught us about compassion, and she raised 3 of the finest young people any of us have ever known. Helena's eyes found Alara in the crowd. Today we do not celebrate 20 years of Alara's presence in Redstone. We celebrate 20 years of the lessons she taught us about grace, about strength, about the true meaning of worth. The applause that followed shook the rafters. Ilara stood with Silas's arm around her waist, tears streaming down her face, looking out at the community that had once rejected her and had become, through patience and forgiveness and stubborn hope, her home. Later that night, back at their hill cabin with Lenore sleeping soundly in the guest room and the stars wheeling slowly overhead, Ilara sat beside Silas on the porch and took his weathered hand in both of hers. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "When I was in that poorhouse scrubbing floors on my hands and knees, I never let myself imagine that life could hold something like this. It seemed too dangerous to hope for." "You made it possible," Silas said. "Your courage, your refusal to let your circumstances become your identity. You did that, Ilara. We did it together. I could not have done any of it without you. You were the first person who believed in me. I just saw what was already there." He said the same words he had spoken 100 times over the years, always with the same quiet conviction. "You were always this strong, this capable, this worthy of love. I was just grateful to be the one who got to walk beside you." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the Texas night, the creek murmuring over stones, the distant call of an owl, the wind whispering through the pines. These were the sounds that had been the soundtrack of their life together, as familiar and essential as their own heartbeats. "Do you ever regret it?" Ilara asked, as she sometimes did, though the question had long since lost any real anxiety. Taking on a poorhouse girl, Silas turned to look at her, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "Not for a single second. Not ever. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Ilara Blackwood. You took a lonely mountain man who was running from his own ghosts and gave him a family, a home, a reason to be grateful for every single morning. If I could live my life over 1,000 times, I would choose you every time. Every single time." She kissed him, then soft and sweet, a kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership and the unshakable certainty that they had built something beautiful from nothing but courage and kindness, and the stubborn refusal to let the world decide their worth. Inside the cabin, Lenore Pruitt slept deeply for the first time in months, dreaming perhaps of gardens and steady meals and the extraordinary kindness of two people who had looked at her hungry, frightened face and seen not a burden but a possibility. Tomorrow, Ilara would begin teaching her about the herbs in the garden. Silas would show her how to feed the chickens and where to find the best water. They would give this girl what someone had once given Ilara, not just work and shelter, but dignity and belief and the radical transformative gift of being truly seen. She came from the poorhouse, the whispers had said all those years ago, meaning it as judgment and condemnation. But Ilara had rewritten that story with every choice she made, every kindness she extended, every day she lived with courage and grace. She had come from the poorhouse, yes, but she had come into love. She had come into purpose. She had come into a life richer and more beautiful than anything she had dared to dream. And now, by helping Lenore, by extending the same hand that had once been extended to her, she would help another lost girl rewrite her story too. Because that, Ilara had learned, was how the world changed. Not through grand gestures or sweeping proclamations, but through ordinary people choosing one small act at a time to see the worth in each other. The mountain man and the poorhouse girl had found each other against every odd, had built a love that weathered every storm, and had created a legacy that would ripple outward through generations, touching lives they would never know, changing destinies they could never predict. It was a story of hope, triumphant of love, conquering prejudice, of two people who dared to see the best in each other, and in doing so brought out the best in themselves and everyone around them. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all.